third episode of building a todo-mvc with Rust as a backend and native web component in the frontend. In the last two episodes, we did the backend with our SQL, and then our Rust server with a model, which is our data layer, a basic security layer, and then our web layer for the REST APIs using Warp. In the database terminal, we can start our Docker PostgreSQL. In our backend terminal, which has a backend folder with our Rust code, we can start our cargo watch with a run to start our server on the frontend web folder. And our server is started. That will save the files that are in the frontend web folder, index.html, that is our hello from todoMVC. And if we pop up a browser, localhost 8080, we get our hello from todoMVC. So far so good, we're all set to go. So first we are going to define our package.json. So our dev dependencies will be rollup. We'll be using rollup to package and compile our TypeScript to JavaScript. And then we're going to use DOM-native, which is a macro library, about 7 kilobytes, which will allow us to use just the native web components, rel DOM, for our component model. So the browser is a framework. We go to frontend. We're going to do an npm install. And now we have all the dependencies installed. Next step, we are going to add our script. And it's just going to be a build for now. And we are going to use rollup. We are going to create our rollup config file. We're going to import the node resolve to make sure that we can import our component with Node.js and our TypeScript compiler. The common.js will be used if we use common.js module, which we are not. The DOM-native is a native ESA module, so we're fine. And then later, if we want to compress the files, we can use parser. We're doing an input, that will be our main. The output, we do the format, and then the plugins, we're setting the plugin that we have above. We're going to create our source, main.ts. Right now, we're just going to do console log. The best practice is to have this notation when we do just debug logs, such as we remove them before we commit. Hello from main.ts. Now we're going to add our tsconfig.json. Very simple, we include everything under source. We target ES 2021, and the module will be ES next for the type module of the package.json. Now we can go back to our terminal and we can do npm run build -- watch to make sure that we can edit live. We see that the JavaScript has been created. So that is going to be our app bundle. And now we need to put it in the index.html like that. We go back to our page. We show the console, press refresh, and we get our hello from main. So we can get coding. We're going to let run the terminal on the background. Since we're on the index.html, we're going to add our style sheet, CSS main.css, which we're going to create right now, our main.css. So we're going to do import the font roboto. Then we're going to have our first section for the base. In the base for all HTML elements, we're going to normalize them. So we're going to have, as a best practice, we're going to make everything box sizing border box. Then, this is a little trick. We need to make everything min width and min height 0 to make sure that the display grid overflow correctly. And then we normalize all of the margin and the padding for all of the elements. Next, we define the common properties for HTML and body. And that will be an application. So the height will be always 100%. This means that the panels will scroll, but the page won't scroll. So again, that's for an app, that's not for a site. Then for HTML, we're going to have an overflow hidden to prevent the bounce. On the body, we're going to pad to rem. We're going to use the rem as the unit, which is 16 pixels. We define the font family and the font size. And then after, we place the children on a grid, justify content center, and we're going to only have one child in this application. And that would be the size of the width, which is from 10 to 40 rem. And that's it. If we go back to our web browser, press Command R, we should see a little of change. Not too much, but at least our main.css was applied. So now we can do our first web component. And for that, we're going to go to index.html. And in this file, we're just going to have todo-mvc. And that will be our component. Obviously, if we refresh, We see blank now, which is fine. And we're going to fix that. In our source file on our main.rs, first we're going to create our first component into the UI folder todo-mvc. And in fact, we're going to put all the components in one file because it's relatively simple. Our component will be a class, and that will be todo-mvc, and it's going to extend base HTML element. And that extends HTML element from the browser. So again, it's a frameworkless, just a library, and we can import it. The way we register it is with the custom element, TypeScript decorator, which comes from DOM native. That is exactly the same as if we had the custom elements from the DOM, define, todo-mvc, todo-mvc. So that will be exactly the same. Now the base HTML element use a connected callback from the native web component, and it will call init only once. So now we can do a HTML content. That will be a document fragment, and the HTML is a tag template that allows us to create the document fragment, and we're going to put our fixed structure. So the important aspect here is you do not put dynamic data. When you create your document fragment, you create your structure, and then you can set the values to it. And then the only thing that we do is that this append HTML content. And now we don't forget to have it into our application. We need to go to main. We can remove this, and we are going to do an import UI todo-mvc. The .js here is optional, but it makes it more compatible with future bundler if we want to use more ESM bundlers later. Now, this file will be loaded. If we go back here, press refresh, and we have our to-do. Now we go back to the file. We see that we have a component todo-input. Can hide the left side. Now we can do a similar for next component, which is going to be todo-input, class, todo-input. And then in this component, we're going to be very similar. We're going to have our init, HTML content, but this time, just going to be a simple input type text with a placeholder. Now, one of the best practice is because later we're going to use this element. So we're going to have a private field, which is going to be input. We're putting exclamation mark because it's not going to be set up at the constructor, but we can assume it is there. So it's going to be an input element. And now the only thing that we need to do is this input EL, and we have a method in DOM native. So it's very fast, and we just say input. And we're going to see later why we need that. Now we do this, append, HTML content. And now we're going to have another trick, which is actually pretty important, is in TypeScript, you can augment global types. And there's a global type, which is HTML element tag name map, which maps the tag name with a class. So every time you define a custom element, it's a good practice in TypeScript to do that, such as you can benefit of the type system later on. And we're going to see how it works. Now, if we go back to our browser, press reload, now we see that we have the what's need to be done. It's just an input. We're going to style everything, but now it's already pretty good progress. Now let's go back to the code. So now the last to-do component that we're going to create is going to be the todo-item. So similar will be a todo-item. The class name will be todo-item. And in our init, our HTML content will be like that with our component check, our custom component. In this episode, we are just going to have a bare bone HTML element for this one, but eventually that could become more of a component. We're going to have the CICO, which is our icon, with the icon done, which will be a SVG icon, and we're going to implement that as a component later. We're going to have a div, which has a class title, and for now, we're just putting a static title. So again, when we build HTML fragment, it's always a good idea to build them with static content and then to set the value later. And then we're going to have our icon, delete, which we are not going to use it, but we're going to position it anyway. Then we're going to use the same technique that we had before. We know we're going to need the title element, exclamation mark, since we are initializing at the init and not at the constructor phase, and that will be a HTML element. So now we can do this title here equal getChild, The getChild is very fast because it just look at the direct children. So it's just one pass iteration. And we know it's the first div. And then finally, we can do this append HTML content. Now, the way it works is the todo-item is very dumb in a way. It doesn't get to the database. It won't fetch the database. Everything will be always sync. And the smart happen at the todo-mvc layer. So in the todo-mvc, we're going to have an async refresh. Right now, it doesn't have to be async, but later it will be async. So we'll see how it works. We're going to have our mock to-dos. So that will be our mock 1 and mock 2. And then we're going to build our HTML content that we're going to ingest into our to-do list. And that will be a normal document, create document fragment. And for this, very simple. We're going to look through all the to-dos. We're going to get the element from a create element to-do item. And here's the magic. If I mouse over to the EL, I see that the type, TypeScript knows that now EL is to-do item. We're using create element from the DOM, but because we augmented the type, we get the right typing. And that is going to be useful later. And then we're just adding it into our document fragment. And then once we have that, we need to add that to the to-do list. But rather to query the element to find the to-do list, we can use the same system that we used before. And in fact, we're going to need two elements. We will need the to-do input EL, which will be a to-do input, and the to-do list, which will be actually just an HTML element. We're not going to do a custom element for the to-do list. And now the way we're going to initialize those is this way. So we do a get children. So that is from DOM native, just iterates through the HTML content, children's, and then for the matching tag name in order that is found, it will create the corresponding list. And so it has to find it, otherwise it's one error. So usually you use that on static content. And then you destructure it into the todo-mvc properties. So now that we have that, we can go back in our refresh, and we're going to do this to-do list EL. So the best practice is to end with EL for anything which is HTML element, dot inner HTML, and that is to empty it. And then we're going to do a to-do list EL, append HTML content. Then obviously on top, on the init, we need to call it. We go back to our web page, press refresh, and we have our static titles. So obviously we want to show the data with the mock 1 and mock 2. So to do that, we're going to create a new file, and we're going to put it in the model folder, and that will be a todo-mvco model client object.ts. And for now, we're just going to export our interface to-do, which will have our ID number, our title as a string, our status open or close. So we go back to our todo-mvc, close the sidebar, and now we can go back to our to-do item, and that will take a data, which will be a type to-do. And we're going to have a setter for the data, which will take the to-do. First, we're going to capture the old data, and we're going to see why later. And then we're going to set the data. And the best practice that we're going to have is we're going to do a freeze. That's pretty aggressive, but that will be the pattern. So anything that is passed to a data of a component, we make it immutable. So that will allow us to give it back without fearing that people can change the data and having everything out of sync. And now we're going to do the if this is connected, which means that basically if it has been initialized, we're going to do a this refresh, and we're going to do a old data. And so the refresh, which we're going to implement, is going to take the old data, an optional old data, but then it will get data to refresh the elements. So on this pattern here, we don't forget to do the get data, which will return this data. And that is safe because it has been frozen. Now we can implement the refresh, which will take an old to do. For now, we're going to focus on the render the new. So first we get the data. We're going to add a new CSS class. And the convention is to do the type, dash, and the ID. And that will allow us later to query the DOM to get very quickly the IDs that have this element. So again, we're leveraging the DOM, what is fast in the DOM, such as we can do that quickly. And then after we add as well the status, open or close, and that will be used to display the different states at the CSS level. And then finally, since we had this title in the init, which we put our div, and this is a fixture over there, it never changes. Then we can do the text content, which is very safe. Do not use in HTML. And then you can give the title. And now, if we had an old value, then we need to make sure that we are removing the old state and the old eventually class names. So to do that, we're going to do if old is not new. We want to make sure that we remove the to-do old ID and we remove the old status. So this one is clean. When it gets at the new data level, it gets all of the new data only. Now we can go back up to our todo-mvc refresh. That will be actually an array of to-dos. And now when we loop through the to-dos, what we can do is here, which we know is a to-do item, data to-do. To-do will be frozen. And then we go back. Obviously, we need to call this.refresh in our to-do item. So the first time we init it, we do a this.refresh. And obviously we don't have any old data. Now we go back here, press reload, and we get our mock1, mock2. So obviously we don't want the mock data, we want the data from the database. So to do that, super easy. We're going to go to our model, our todo-mco, and that is where we're going to create our first model client object. So first we're going to create our object to-do patch, which is going to be the partial of to-do except ID. Our todo-mco will be a class that will export as a singleton. Now what we want is an async list that will return to-dos. And for that, we need to do a web request to the backend. So the best practice that we're going to follow is we're going to create a new file, which is going to be our webc for web client. We're going to have our web methods, our API base, and the goal with our webc is not to do an Ajax framework or a client frameworks, is we're going to use the native fetch, but wrap it such as we can normalize it across our application code. So in this example, we're going to have a web call that takes a web method, a path, and a data. And that will just use the fetch from the native browser. And for now, we're going to hardcode our XHost token to 123. There's many ways to get your token. Sometimes I actually like it to have HTTP only in the cookie, such as in JavaScript, you don't even have it. But in the case where you need it, that is where you will put it and you will fetch it from the memory after login. And then we're going to export convenient API, such as we can use the webget, webpost, webpath, and webdelete. So again, the goal of this is to wrap all HTTP requests the application way, such as later you can add logging, error reporting, web events, and all of these kind of things. So now that we have that, we can go back to our todo-mco and we can implement our list. And it's very simple. We're going to do a webget with our to-dos, and that will return all of the data, and we can return it with data as to-do. And we are not with Rust, so we need to specify that that is a promise of the to-do array. So now that we have that, we can go back to our UI in our todo-mvc. We're going to go to our todo-mvc class, and in the refresh function, rather to have the mock, we're going to use our todo-mco.list, and the await is before. Go back to our page, press reload, to-do 101, to-do 100. And that is pretty cool. Obviously, it's super ugly, so let's make it nice. So let's open our web folder, CSS, and our main.css. We have our base from before. We're going to add some CSS var, just as a best practice. Obviously, this is very short, but eventually you will probably have that in another file. The first section that we're going to have is for the icon. So the C icon, we're going to see later how we're going to do this. But for now, if we reload the page, we're going to see all of these little squares. Then we're going to add all of the todo-mvc CSS. If we reload, now that looks better. We have done the display grid. We have the box, which is a box shadow as a background. And we are positioning the elements like that, such as we can be very precise. We have our H1, which is our title at the top. We have our to-do input. We're just doing the placement. We're going to style it later in the to-do input section. And then we have the to-do list, which again, we're just doing the placement. We're going to position it later. If we go back at the top, close the section. The next section is going to be our to-do input. So if we press refresh, we're going to see the nice to-do input. And the way we do it is we're doing a display grid. We're having our input padding and all of the style of the input element. And then we're even styling the placeholder. So the next region will be the to-do list. Very simple. This one we're mostly placing it. We're not going to see any change there, just to make sure that we have the right scrolls. And then the big one is our to-do item. So if we refresh, that is starting to look good. We're going to remove the border on the C icon to have the full experience. And the to-do item layout is big but relatively simple. We're doing the padding, some styling. We're displaying everything with grid. That is a columns base. So we have one cell here, and then one cell at the end for the delete. We have the check, which is our little checkbox. And that obviously can move to another component, even to a shadow DOM probably. And then we have our states that have the close for check, and the close for check and icon. And then we even have animations. So everything is relatively simple. So one thing that we don't have is the SVG icon, the little check mark. We're going to go to our index.html. And one strategy that we have, we actually put all our SVG sprites inside the body. So we have a script that gets it and put it inside the document. And that makes it much more convenient to style in CSS. There might be different techniques, but that is what we're using. So now we need to display it on the right. And to do that, we need to implement our custom elements, CICO. So we're going to create a file under UI, which is going to be comments, and that will be for the comments component. Obviously later, as the application grows, you will move that to different files. Very quickly, the same, we have a custom element, CICO. We extend base HTML element, which is from DOM native, but we could extend HTML element that will work exactly the same. Then we get the icon name from the attribute, and then we're going to add the SVG with the use tag in the HTML content. And then obviously we append the content. We'll go back to our main, and we're going to make sure that we import it, UI comments.js. And if we go back here, we have our checkbox. And now we're going to do the click on the checkbox and also entering a new one. So for that, relatively simple. Let's put ourselves in a code mode. And we're going to go to our model. And then the first one we're going to do is going to be our async create. We'll take a to-do patch and we'll return a promise of to-do. First, we're going to validate the data. Later, you can have more sophisticated validation. But right now, we're just going to make sure that there is a title for create at least, and that is not empty. We're going to send the data to the server with a web post. So that is our ROS server that we did before, exactly the same. Then once the data come back, so we're doing an await, we're doing a web post. And when we get the data, we're going to send an event. So that is from DOM native, which is a hub event. You give a name, and then you can publish event to it. This is a topic, this is a label that can be queried after, and that is a data, any data you want. So that will allow us to do data events without really knowing about data or UI. It's just a way to have a pub sub inside the client. Very small and very useful. So you don't need complex state management if you have a good event model. And then finally, we return the data. Usually the UI shouldn't get anything back. It should wait until the data event, and it shouldn't react to the return value. So that will be good for the create. Now we're going to do the update. Very similar, except that now it's going to take a ID plus the data. Later, you might want to again validate the to-do patch with some sort of assets. Now we're going to send the event to the server. We're going to do the data hub. So same hub, we send the event with the same topic, because that's to do. And then the label, we're going to say update. We give the new data, and then we return the data. Next one is going to be the delete. Similar, delete, just the ID this time. We're calling it to the web delete with a path, and we're getting back the old data. So that is what we did in Rust before. It returned the old data. Now on the hub, again, the same topic, which is going to be the model type name, the action, and the data. And then we return the data as well. Now that we have our to-do model client object done, we can go back to our UI, todo-mvc, and the code design we are going to follow is that we're going to have a section, which is going to be for the event, is going to be the todo-mvc container, which is going to listen to the event of the checkbox. But in this case, it's very scalable because you don't have to have a ON bindings on all the checkbox. You can just bubble it up. So for our UI events, we're going to register a function. And the function will have this type decorator, which comes from .native, and it does nothing more than just doing a add event listener on the todo-mvc for the event pointer up, and then it will check that the selector ccheck is matched. And if it is, it's going to call this function with a todo-mvc context. So it's just a convenience. You can do exactly the same thing with just add event listeners. So now that we have this function, we can get the todo-item from the closest of the checkbox. So we go back to the tree, we get the todo-item. And the nice thing is that if we mouse over, it will be todo-item again. That is why the type augmentation was very useful. And then we're going to toggle the status. So we are taking the data, which is immutable, so we cannot change it anyway, but we can read it. And if the status is open, we're going to make it close, otherwise we're going to make it open. And then we're going to update the server with only the status. And everything is typed here, so we know that we're passing the right data. And now that we have done that, the data will be sent to the server. And we do not want to wait, because the right way of doing it is with a data event. And so in our data events, we're going to have a method, which is onToDoUpdate, and we're going to use a type decorator on hub, which only does a subscription to the data hub object, and is going to register on the topic todo and the label update. And that will get called with a todo-mvc context, and if todo-mvc gets removed from the DOM, it will get unregistered automatically. So that is what the base HTML element gives us. Now in this function, we're going to find the to-do in the UI. So here we're doing a first and we're doing a todo-item. And so we're going to find the element, and eventually we can find all of the elements that have the same if we have multiple, or we can be very flexible. And then the only thing we need to do is to say, if we find it, we update it, and we just need to do the .data. The data will be frozen and everything will be updated. And the way that it gets updated is the responsibility of todo-item. And we go back to the browser, we're going to reload it, and now that really works. Now, if we don't believe it, we can have our PSQL. We're going to do a select ID, title, status from to-do, order by ID descending to have the same order than in the UI. We're going to do a watch every 1 second. And now, if we click in the UI, we see the database changing. So everything works very well. So far, so good. So let's close that for now and go back to our code. Now, to show the power of this model, what we can do is a create. We're going to go to the todo input. And then we're going to add our UI events. And that will be our onKey up of input. And when it's up, if it's enter, we're going to get the value from the input element. We're going to send to the server the MCO create. And here we are not doing a wait because we don't need to wait for the result. And without waiting, we're just going to set the value to empty because the data is gone. And now we can handle the error, if there were an error, as a notification or something. If we really wanted, we could still do a try catch. It will be a little bit of an anti-pattern, but sometimes you might want to do that if you have advanced behaviors. The most important is you never update data based on the data sent. You wait until the data events come back. So now the way we are going to update the data is obviously not at the to-do input level. Back in our todo-mvc data events, we're going to add another data event, and this one is going to be super simple. And it's just going to be on hub, to-do, create, and we're going to refresh the whole thing. And the goal here is not to try to be too smart on the client, because when you create a new data, you don't know if other data is also created on the server. So sometimes you want to fetch and refresh anything to make sure that your UI doesn't get stale. And now, if we go back to our UI, let's try it, and then that's it. And it works. And again, if we don't believe it, we can go to our PSQL, do our select, do our watch, and then we can see that that works. And this is cool. And then that's it. Everything works. And that will be it for this episode. Hope you liked it. Feel free to add a like. Until next one, happy coding.